want to get into subcontract. If there's folks out there discussing, okay, well, if I don't own the product, how do I sell the product?
Subcontracting can be a great tool. There is a lot to take into consideration when you're kind of crafting your subcontracting strategy.
What are some of the other issues that small businesses are facing?
So there will be limitations on how much you can subcontract. If you're using a device that has TikTok on it and you're also using that device to perform your government contract, like that's a problem. So the government could point to the clause within the contract and say, hey, you violated this clause, right? And then they could maybe terminate your contract for default.
Do you go to jail?
The foundational issue here is that that's a breach of your contract obligations to the government.
If you were to do that, what happens legally?
A few different things could happen. Now, there's certainly ways to prepare yourself to not be in that situation, right? By setting.
All right, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Cara Wulf. I am a partner with McCarter and English in the Government Contracts Group. My practice focuses entirely on helping companies of all shapes and sizes deal with the landscape of government contracting. So all the regulations that go into, what it takes to be a successful government contractor, helping them manage relationships with the government and with, contracting partners at the prime and sub level, everything from navigating small business regulations to bid protests, claims and appeals, the whole 9 yards. Before joining McCarter, I was actually an attorney with the Department of Defense for the first several years of my career. So I've looked at these issues kind of both from the government and the private sector side. So that's been my kind of focus my entire career, and really looking forward to chatting about it.
No, thank you for that introduction. That's great. And what I'd like to talk about today, before we get into your background, just so that the audience is aware, I want to get into subcontracting. That's a very popular topic with our audience, right? It's somewhat confusing for people, right? Because there's folks out there discussing, okay, well, if I don't own the product, how do I sell the product, and what are the rules surrounding that? And again, specifically as it comes to services, and right, what happens if I don't meet the subcontract goals? What happens if I get a contract and I can't meet the percentage of work performed, right? What does that look like? So if you don't mind, I'd love to open up with that to start off the conversation.
Yeah, sure. So subcontracting can be a great tool when you're in the position of being a prime contractor, and you have this award from the government that requires you to maybe supply certain things or perform certain services. You may not have all the abilities that you need in-house to meet those requirements. So subcontracting can be a great tool to help you get there. There is a lot to take into consideration when you're kind of crafting your subcontracting strategy. And I think you touched on one of them, which is, what are the subcontracting goals that the government has put in place with regard to doing business with certain categories of small businesses. If you're a small business, that's being awarded the contract, you might have different considerations, but if the government has as a goal to award, as much federal contracting dollars as possible to small businesses. And so, as part of that, they have set certain benchmarks of aspirational goals in some cases to certain types of small businesses. So women-owned small businesses, service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. There's a whole range of alphabet soup acronyms for these types of businesses, but that's something to keep in mind as you're dealing with that. Now, depending on the subject of the contract and where you're geographically located, it might be difficult to fall into one of those categories to meet those subcontracting goals. That's when you need to evaluate what steps you've taken to try to identify those companies that meet those requirements, and communicate with the government about those efforts so that you're not running afoul of those contractual requirements. The other thing to think about when you're crafting your subcontracting strategy is how much of the work are you going to be subcontracting, right? Are you going to be doing, what do you need your subcontractors to do? The prime contract, especially if we're dealing with a small business prime contract, will have some self-performance requirements in it. So there will be limitations on how much you can subcontract to other entities. Because again, the government is looking to award these contracts to small businesses and to have small businesses grow and develop as a result of these contractual arrangements. So if a small business were to turn around and subcontract everything to a large business, that goal is not really being met. So what the government has done, what you'll see in your prime contract, is there will be a limitation on how much can be subcontracted out to businesses that are not what we call similarly situated, right? So they could be the same type of small business, or in some cases, other types of small businesses, just to make sure that the government's kind of policy goal of keeping small businesses um, in this process is being met. So, like I said at the beginning, a lot of opportunity to subcontract. You can have some great relationships that will grow over time. But you do have to be careful about some of those restrictions that you're going to see in the terms of your prime contract.
Let me ask, because I know a little bit about the subject. I've been talking about it for several years, but I've never been on the side of the legal aspect of it, right? So, for example, the requirement states that you cannot award a contract more greater than 50%, right? If you were to do that, what happens legally?
Hey guys, this is Eric Coffie with Govcon Giants here, and I'm so happy to announce a strategic partnership that we have with Encore Funding. As you know, for many, many years, I've been helping you successfully navigate the world of government contracting and helping you win contracts. But as you know, we've always fell short in trying to help get you access to capital. Well, with our new strategic partnership with Encore Funding, we've now closed that gap. Whether you are in the goods space or services space, we can help you. Now, I will say this, right now we are focused on companies particularly that have services in align with goods. So if you're just reselling products, we haven't solved that issue for you yet. However, if you have a service that comes with a product, or a product, that comes with a service, there's an area where we are able to help you out. So again, I'm going to have all the information below for those of you who are interested. And also you'll start to see more and more content that we're doing together, educating you on the funding process. What does it take to get started? What do you need? And you'll be very surprised. The bar is pretty low on what the requirements are. So we have said in some of our content that we shot today and over the last few days that we are a second chance lender, meaning that if you've got some credit challenges or you're just getting started in business, we still can lend based on the actual contracts themselves. So again, unlike things that I've heard in the past, this is definitely something that we are bringing to the table for our students, for all of our people that are watching us online on all the places where we put out content. And so I'm very happy to talk about this product in upcoming interviews and episodes. So stay on the lookout for that as we continue to evolve this relationship and grow it and bring you access to the dollars that you need in order to secure the contracts that you're going to win. Helping all of you grow and achieve massive success in this federal marketplace, taking you and building you into the giants that I know you are. So stay tuned. Look forward to more content with us and our partners, Encore Funding.
Yeah, I mean that a few different things could happen, right? I mean, there's a range of remedies the government could potentially have in that situation.
Okay.
You know, depending on the underlying facts of how that came about. Ultimately, at the end of the day, like the foundational issue here is that that's a breach of your contract obligations to the government. So the government could point to the clause that's in the contract and say, you violated this clause, you know, you're in default, maybe, right? And then they could maybe terminate your contract for default. They could potentially, you know, have you go back and subcontract with somebody else, so as not to run afoul of that. I mean, there's a range of options that the government could have here, but I think, you know, it ranges from let's try to fix it all the way up to, you know, you violated the terms of your contract, you maybe committed a False Claims Act violation, right? You've not been subcontracting in accordance with what the contract requires. You've been certifying your invoices as though you have. You could have some real serious consequences there. So, you know, it's definitely something that we would, you know, like to talk about at the beginning of the subcontracting strategy to make sure that you're not going to run into those types of issues.
Do you go to jail?
There is criminal liability available.
Okay.
It's civil and criminal liability is available under the False Claims Act. Now,
Okay.
there are different kind of thresholds for what triggers a criminal violation versus what triggers a civil violation. You know, it has to be pretty egregious to be on the criminal side, but we've seen it. You know, it happens. You see these headlines all the time of people getting sentenced for various false claims made to the government. So yeah, I mean that's what we're here to help avoid.
No, no, no. And I want to avoid that too. What I find is that a lot of times when we discuss these things, we don't talk about the severity of it. And so I think people take it very lightly. And I want people to know that you know, that is a potential consequence, right, for
Oh
doing
yeah,
consistently over time and probably deliberately, right, in some
sure,
respect.
sure.
If once you've been made aware of it, you can't have plausible deniability. So you've got to, like, okay, you've done this consistently over time, right, over multiple contracts. I'm sure there's got to be some sort of
Right. And there's a range of bad behavior that can lead to different, False Claims Act consequences. Certainly criminal liability, jail time, and massive fines are one of them. Even the civil liability, though, I mean, you may have seen the headlines on, the Department of Justice will every now and again. I saw one just earlier this week that was, several $1 million in a False Claims Act settlement. So that's not even getting to the point of finding of liability. There's just massive settlements that the DOJ is announcing on a regular basis that are just huge financial hits for companies that are running afoul of these requirements. So yes, jail time is potentially on the table here, but you could have really significant consequences to your business, not only in the terms of how many millions of dollars you're paying to the government, but reputational impacts as well. Right. So is that range of severity that you're talking about that could really, really harm somebody who's not paying attention to what their contractual obligations are.
No, that makes sense. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to let people know, because I want to be very direct, and I want people to know that this is serious. And we want people here, at least the people that are listening to what we got to say, to do things of high, ethical standard, moral standard, according to what they agreed upon. And if you can't do it, just don't sign up for it.
Right.
That's
Yeah, and there's, we're talking about the subcontractor requirements, but this is something where you could have any host of the regulatory requirements in your government contracts could be the subject of a False Claims Act violation. Now, there's certainly ways to prepare yourself to not be in that situation, right? By setting up robust compliance structures, having training for your folks to make sure they understand the rules. I think where we see a lot of people fall into these traps is when you're used to doing business, in the commercial space, maybe, where you don't have the same kind of requirements that the government will impose on you as a government contractor. So just understanding the difference between those two worlds, and like I said, having those compliance structures in place to make sure that you've got a system that runs smoothly and you're not running into these types of issues.
I want to talk about the compliance structures, but I still have another question on the subcontracting.
Sure.
What is the difference requirements wise from subcontracting if the contract is set aside in one of the, say, socioeconomic categories, or even small business, versus if it's full and open?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when you're dealing with the set aside, that's really where you're going to see the limitations on subcontracting come into play, right? Because again, the government is specifically setting aside this work for small businesses with the goal of, like I said, developing those small businesses and having them perform the work, and eventually becoming to grow and to be more successful over time. So in order to achieve that, the government is looking to make sure that those entities are not, like I said, turning around and subcontracting to major corporation A, right?
Right.
So that defeats the whole purpose. Which isn't to say that I think you mentioned the 50% limitation, right? That isn't to say that you can't have relationships with those major corporations that, might be beneficial to performance of the contract, but you just have to be mindful of what those limitations are and make sure that you're not just turning around and subcontracting everything when there are those limitations in place.
No, that makes sense. And so on the full and open competition, right, then it really, that goes out the window.
Yeah, I would still want to look and make sure there isn't anything else that the government has put in. Then you might be more in the realm of, are we worried about kind of the opposite situation where we're trying to meet small business subcontracting goals, where we do want to reach out to certain small businesses and try to make sure that they're included in this as well. But ultimately, you don't want to make too broad of a generalization, because you want to look at the contract and see if there's something specific, because I've seen funky stuff in contracts where you never know, right? So you want to take a look and make sure there's no kind of limitation that's built into those types of contracts as well.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier that there are several things that can trigger False Claims Act. What are some of those other things?
Yeah, so I've seen a whole host of them. I think like the classic example is charging the government for something that they didn't receive, right? For a product that they didn't receive, or a service that they didn't receive, overcharging. That's kind of the classic example, if you will. A little bit of history. I think the False Claims Act came into effect during or shortly after the Civil War, but because there were a lot of suppliers to the Union Army that were overcharging or not delivering what they said they were going to deliver, so they put this in place to try to mitigate some of that bad action. And that's, it's been 150 some years. since that's been in place. So it's obviously a tool that the government uses very frequently. So that's kind of the classic example is I charged you for 1,000 widgets and I delivered 700, right? Something like that. Or I said my people were working 8 hours a day, but they're really working 4, things like that. So that's one potential problem. The non-compliances can be another basis for False Claims Act liability. So we mentioned the subcontracting limitations. Another one I've seen is like the domestic preference requirements. So if you've got Buy American requirements in your contract, and the contract says contractor shall only deliver, domestic end products to the government, right? Which means something specific in the context of the regulation. But if your contract says that, and you're committed to that, and you supply items from China, let's say, or another country that's not domestic, really any of them, then China's usually the one that raises everybody's eyebrows. But that will be something that could potentially trigger False Claims Act violations, especially if you're certifying that you've complied with the requirements. You're telling the government that everything is in compliance with those requirements, and that they should pay you the full amount of the contract. That's another area where these can get really, really, really problematic. And I like that example because it's often very visual. Something gets delivered to the job site that's got "Made in China" stamped on it. It's a pretty good indication that something might not be correct. So there's just a host of ways that could come into play. I could keep going, but
I've done it before.
Yeah.
Yeah, we bought from a supplier that was American-made supplier. They said that, they're made, but then they sent us the products, and we're still made in China.
Yeah, it happens all the time. Yeah.
I'm like, wait. We ordered from you because you're an American-made supplier, and then you went and bought the stuff from China and then sent it to me.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a problem.
And like you said, it came stamped "Made in China." Made in China.
Yeah, it usually does. Yeah, that's the red flag.
No, it was made in China.
And I've heard countless horror stories about that. And sometimes with suppliers too, if they're savvy and used to doing business in the government supply chain, maybe they do have a set of their product that's made in a non-US or non-designated country, if we're talking about the Trade Agreements Act. It's made in the country that they can't supply to the government without some sort of a waiver or approval. Maybe they're selling those in the commercial marketplace, and then they have another warehouse or supply chain source where they send those products that are compliant. So I've seen that happen too, where they just get mixed up, and you just have to be diligent. I think that's a good point, to be diligent at the level that you're talking about. When I'm the recipient of those goods, I'm passing them along to the government. What controls do I have in place to make sure that I'm getting what I need to comply with the requirements that I have in the prime contract?
Yeah, in our situation, which is interesting, I've seen this all the time happen, where people, I can see people with their trucks, and the government would take all these boxes of screws and put them on the back of the truck and say, "Get them out of this facility. You can't have them here." And they just stack up a whole bunch of boxes of screws and bolts and nuts and "Made in China," and they're like, take them off the job site. They can't be.
Well, at least they weren't already installed, right? I've had situations where the government says you got to rip it out. You got to start over.
They were redoing some dorms, and they were putting in kitchen sinks, and all the sinks had to be ripped out.
Yeah, because it's a violation of the contract requirements. And like I said, that gets into the question of the range of remedies that the government has for that sort of non-compliance. Is rip it out and replace it at your own cost, and you're not going to get a schedule increase.
Right.
It's preferable to a False Claims Act violation, but still not a great situation. Yeah,
especially not when you have liquidated damages pending as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, no, that's good. Let's talk about what are some of the other issues that you see come across your desk that small businesses are facing, or challenges they're facing that maybe I'm not thinking about right now.
Yeah, I think going back to the subcontracting piece of it too. I think in terms of setting up if you're a large contractor, I've seen a lot of large contractors that have subcontract templates that are already built out with their standard terms and conditions and a set of FAR, DFARs, or whatever agency flow down requirements they're all built into it. And small businesses sometimes receive those documents and maybe sign them without thinking about what's in there. I think those are really important documents to have somebody review, an attorney review, to make sure that you're not signing up for something that doesn't apply to you as a small business, or that isn't overly burdensome for the type of contract that you're dealing with. It gets into the negotiation. It's a little bit less legal and a little bit more kind of business relationship at a certain point. But, to be able to identify those risk areas and highlight them, so you don't end up in a situation where, things are going well, and then 5 months down the line, you have a dispute, and then you're stuck with whatever the subcontract says. So doing that review early on, kind of with the mindset of, it's a pessimistic view, but I guess that's what lawyers do. It's what happens if we have a dispute? Everybody's feeling great right now. We've got the work. We're going to do a great job together. But if something were to go off, then how do we address that? So having that reviewed, something that folks could think about. On the flip side, as a small business, if you're in the position of being a prime contractor, if you're going to subcontract, do you have something in place that reflects the terms and conditions that work for you and the flow downs that you're required to send on to your subcontractors? Do you have a template? Do you have an idea of how you want to manage that relationship? Setting up something like that, that has to be customized for every different situation, but that can really streamline your ability to work with other companies going forward. And to submit your paper is the document that you'll be working from, as opposed to responding to somebody else's. So just a couple of different ways to think about the subcontracting relationship as a small business from the get-go.
Now, I'll tell you something I did, but don't jump through the screen at me, okay? I take the big boys contracts and I modify it, and then I make them my subcontracts for my subs. What do you think about that?
I mean, look, there's a lot of good stuff in a lot of the contracts that are out there. There's a set of best practices that I think a lot of contractors use and borrow from one another, right? So there's not always a lot of difference between what works for one contractor versus what works for another. I think the key here is just, like you said, to modify it for whatever your business needs.
Right.
And what your payment term, when do you want to get paid, as opposed to when do the big guys want to get paid? What are your termination procedures going to be like? Do you need more notice if you're going to terminate somebody? That just sort of has to fit into whatever your business model is, and making sure that reflects. But it doesn't have to be, created out of whole cloth necessarily. As I said, there are best practices that we can use over and over again, but just understanding how those fit with your business and what you need.
Okay, good. You didn't beat me up too bad. I was concerned. No, I can't. When you're, it's a lot when you're starting out, right? And there's a lot of things that you have to keep in consideration. And to your point, when you're reading these agreements, even from the government, there's a lot of clauses that I just don't think a lot of people understand. And I don't know if that's intentional or not intentional, but it's one of those things. It's difficult to understand some of this stuff. Even if you read it in English, you still don't understand some of these things.
Well, I think people sometimes, they aren't always clauses that are in there in full text either. There's just a list of numbers, basically. It's like, how long is my contract? Oh, it's 5 pages long. It's like, yeah, but 3 of those pages are a list of clauses that have, a lot that are baked in there. So a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, mistakes happen. Sometimes there are clauses in contracts, FAR clauses or DFARS clauses, that shouldn't be in there, that don't apply to a particular scope of work, or that don't apply to a particular type of contractor. So just a review to identify those and take those out. Then there are situations where you'll see the kitchen sink thrown in, and people aren't doing that kind of analysis of, okay, these are the specific clauses that would apply in this situation. Kind of going back on what I said earlier, that's the template approach. Like, here's everything. Let's put that all in. Right. There's efficiency there, I suppose, but that's also, raises issues later when people say things like, oh, it's self-deleting if it doesn't apply, I hear that all the time, and it just makes me cringe, because who's going to determine whether it doesn't apply if it comes to it, right? If the clause is in there, it's potentially applicable. So if it doesn't apply, take it out. But those are the sort of things that I see most often on that.
The Another thing that we find is when we're working with the government, you brought up 2 points. You said, hey, if it doesn't apply, take it out. But we don't have that leverage to tell the government that.
No, not always. It's worth a shot. It's worth a shot. I've had situations where, especially in like the solicitation Q&A phase, if you see something in there that doesn't make sense, or that just, like I said, people make mistakes. It could be an error. I've had success pointing that out and saying, respectfully, does this clause belong in this contract? And sometimes the answer is, whoops, you're right. No, it doesn't. It gets there, or we've got two conflicting clauses that are in there. Which is it? So then that can kind of clear up some of that confusion. And then if the government doesn't, if it's truly a conflict, or if it's truly inapplicable and it has some sort of a bearing on how you're going to bid the work, that could be the basis for a bid protest too, a pre-award bid protest. So there are tools we can use to kind of push back on the government where they've done something in the contract terms that doesn't make sense, but it has to be done, through the appropriate procedures. But yes, there are situations where the government's just going to say, nope, this is what it is, and you have to decide if you're going to live with that or not, and hope for the best. But I've had success pushing back when there's a good reason to.
Let's talk about you mentioned it, the subcontracting plan, right? But I have a specific example of if I'm a small business and, for example, I'm selling a product to the government and I see that they're awarding these contracts to large firms, they're not subcontractors, but small firms. What remedy do I have? Who should I be talking to? Right? What were some of the steps that you recommend people take?
Yeah. So, what we could potentially do in that situation is take a look and see whether the government has kind of properly set up the acquisition strategy, and whether it should have been a set aside type situation, or whether they should be doing something that's more friendly to small businesses. Again, that's going to kind of depend on the mechanics of the acquisition and the specifics of the situation. But that's something we could look at is, hey, the government's doing this in a way that's not consistent with what they should be doing. How do we challenge that? And then we could take a look at the regulations, and see where there might be some daylight.
Who should I be speaking to on that? I usually recommend they speak to the ombudsman if they have a challenge problem with the government.
Yeah, that's one avenue. I mean, lawyers obviously can kind of pull that string too. Yeah, the small business ombudsman can sometimes have some influence there. But if we're really getting into the weeds of, like I said, a pre-award bid protest type situation, or really challenging something, it might make sense to get counsel involved, so that there's a more formal pursuit of what you want to do.
Okay. No.
But it does range from how far do I want to take. Right. I mean, lawyers can escalate things, right? But
right.
For better or for worse, right? I mean, there's value in that. I think, obviously, but I think that there are some less formal ways to do that. Through the ombudsman is one example.
Since you brought that up, let's stick with that topic. Because to your point, right? If I'm a small business, I mean, I've seen the big companies sue the government all the time. Like, they don't care. They'll pull you. But if I'm a small business, I'm thinking like, I don't want to mess up my relationship with this agency. What do you think the impression that you give if you were to do that is on an agency, right? How do you feel about that? What have you seen?
I hear that a lot. I hear that concern a lot, from a lot of businesses. But yeah, a lot of small businesses, but all businesses really are just, I don't want to be a squeaky wheel. I don't want to, hurt my relationship with the government, with the contract. Whether it's pre-award, do I want to protest this? Am I going to be seen as a troublemaker if I do that? Even during performance, like, oh, the government's asking me to do this, but it's really outside the scope of my contract. But I don't want to ruffle any feathers by asking for an adjustment, so I'm just going to do it at my own cost. That's an option, right? That's a business strategy. But I think that, my experience, the regulations are set up the way that they are for a reason. And there are there's mechanisms here to kind of prompt the government to take action in a way that's consistent with those regulations. And I think that's an expected part of the process.
Okay.
protesting, request for equitable adjustments, claims, that's all part of it, right? I think to some extent the government expects that. And like you say, that happens all the time. So, that's something that I think, a concern that I think is largely misplaced, because, there's more and less combative ways to do everything, of course, right? So you can always approach it, how like the bid protest, for example. There's basically three different ways that you could file a bid protest. You could do an agency level protest, a Government Accountability Office, GAO protest, or a Court of Federal Claims protest. And they've kind of listed those in increasing order of dramaticness, if you will, right? So, that's the litigiousness, maybe is a better word. Yeah. So, maybe I want to nudge the agency and say, hey, we think this might not be the right way to do this, submit that through the agency channels. I will say those are generally less successful because you're asking the agency to second guess itself, which it doesn't often like to do. The GAO protests that happen, I mean, this time of year, especially, we're just coming into the new fiscal year. So many contracts got awarded at the end of the last fiscal year. There's a ton of protests going on right now from that activity. So it's a common part of government contract. And I'll say from my experience being on the government side too, that's how I looked at it at that point in time too. Of course, I'm just one person, but I think that is something that is expected. And like I said, you can do it in a way that's not going to be too combative and relationship damaging. But I think the process itself is there for a reason.
What made you leave government, come to the private sector?
Just a handful of different factors. I really enjoyed the ability to kind of work with companies and kind of help them progress their businesses. I think I loved working for the government. I had great experience there, great relationships there. But I do like working on the business side of things as well, kind of helping companies navigate those rules and understand how to develop themselves and how to provide good value for the taxpayer too. I've still got that piece, right, when it comes to making sure that everybody's getting what they want out of the relationship. But I think that was a large driver for me, was working with companies.
The types of companies that you work with, what are their sizes, employee counts?
It runs the gamut. I've worked with companies that are like a mom and pop type, literally in some cases, right? Very, very small businesses that have, very specialized skill sets and are providing great value and are in demand. Businesses of varying small business statuses, like growing and graduating from the 8A program, that kind of thing, all the way up to big corporations that have, like you say, big ideas about how to work with the government and what their preferred kind of strategies are. So it's been really interesting to see, and the advice changes depending on the company's strategy and how they want to grow and what the relationship they want to have with the government is. So it's fascinating to work with companies of all different shapes and sizes.
I read in your experience, it says you were a trial attorney at DCMA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what did you go to trial about?
So at DCMA, the Defense Contract Management Agency, I was in their contract disputes resolution group. And so DCMA, my role focused primarily on disputes arising out of cost reimbursement contracts. So allowable costs, contractors would submit their incurred cost submissions, DCAA would audit them, say, I think you've charged the government for this and that and the other unallowable cost. Therefore, we're issuing, contracting officer issues a final decision, says you owe the government X amount of money. Contractor says, I disagree. And so then they end up in litigation. And that's that's where I would start to get involved, is working through those lawsuits. I still do that on the private side too, just on the different side of the equation.
Okay. No, that's a great example. What are some steps practically that small business can do to avoid disputes and litigation?
Well, yeah, I think a couple of
want to end up in court.
No, it's not. I mean, some do, right? But I think, yeah, for the most part, it's not at best, it's disruptive, right? To what you want to do day in and day out, right? You've got lawyers for that, but most people don't want to do litigation. I recognize that. But I think, a couple of different couple of different things there. So if you're talking about litigation, with a subcontractor, you're really working on a commercial relationship at that point. So that's more of a commercial transaction between two parties that absolutely has government contracts implications to it. You've got those flow downs, you've got all the requirements from the prime contract that you have to manage, but ultimately that can turn into a commercial dispute. And to avoid that, I think, like I was saying earlier, one of the most important things you can do is make sure you have a robust subcontract that addresses areas that are new things happen every day. Subcontract terms that we've drafted over the years have evolved based on experiences that we've had with disputes. But if you've got a robust set of terms that can help you navigate the common areas of dispute, that can help you navigate those at the business level and not have to end up in litigation. So that's that's sort of one path. When you're dealing with the government specifically, it's not that dissimilar. It's just you're going to have slightly more narrow ability to negotiate, as you pointed out, and you're going to have some limitations on how you're able to bring suit against the government. So the Contract Disputes Act is basically what allows you to sue the government, right? Otherwise, there's sovereign immunity. You can't sue the government. You have to go through certain steps to be able to bring litigation against the government, which involves, going through the claims process, certain certifications, things like that. I think working with the government requires, an understanding of those processes, where the sort of mile markers are along the way of a dispute as you start to realize that you and the government are not on the same page about things, whether in terms of a changed scope or, a disputed cost, like I mentioned, just a whole host of ways that the government could, that you and the government could be out of alignment on that. So, I like to think of it like a lot of it has to do with your approach to it, right? If you're coming at it like we're adversaries, you're going to end up adversaries. If you're coming at it like we're trying to, we're a team, we're trying to work together, it doesn't always work. People's personalities are different and you end up in different situations. But I think that can go a long way towards avoiding the litigation path if you're willing to work with the other party, be it the government or another commercial entity, to try to reach a resolution. But ultimately, just building the terms out so you have clear guidance on how disputes will be handled can sometimes go a long way towards avoiding protracted litigation.
One thing that you mentioned earlier in our conversation at the beginning was having and I don't remember the words that you used, but essentially, when we talked about the contracts and all the different clauses, you mentioned having some sort of system that manages the risk of all the clauses. I forgot the name that you called it.
Compliance structure.
Yeah, compliance structure. What does that look like? Is that a Google Doc? Is that some sort of software? Look,
no,
does that look
that's
like,
a great question.
right?
Yeah, sure. So your contract is going to have, a variety of FAR clauses in there that are going to require you to do things like have a code of business ethics and conduct, to have certain policies and procedures addressing maybe some socioeconomic goals that the government has put into the FAR. I think the way that we would typically do that would be, let's look at all the clauses that are in your contract, first of all, and identify everything like that. So the Code of Business Ethics and Conduct is a pretty good example of that. You have to have one, right? And it's got to address certain categories of behavior. You've got other clauses that'll talk about anti-kickback or gratuities or things like that you can build in. Just having a holistic look at all your requirements, which the requirements I'm talking about are kind of outside of the scope of the substance of the contract, right? Here are the certain guardrails you have to have in place to make sure that you're a responsible steward of taxpayer dollars, that your employees conduct themselves in accordance with ethical principles, that you're not walking into conflicts of interest, that you're not bribing anybody, right? Just a whole variety of potential behaviors that are forbidden in government contracting. So understanding the scope of that, and then setting up a set of policies and procedures that address all of those areas. And again, there are best practices there as well. I think, we've done that many times for companies of many different, walks of life. So you do customize it based on the structure of the company and based on what their particular needs are. But having those in place, drafting those up and making sure they meet all the contractual requirements, and then having a training session with employees to make sure they understand. Like, look, you can't take your contracting officer out for a steak dinner with a seafood tower, right? You can't buy them a new car. You can't do the things that you might otherwise do in a commercial relationship, right? There's limitations on that. And so making sure that people understand what those are and that they're thinking mindfully about, okay, these are the principles of doing business with the government I have to know when I'm out in the field trying to develop our business. And then periodically updating those documents and refreshing that training to make sure that everybody's aware of the requirements and that the documents are up to date, because the FAR clauses change at a fairly regular clip. New responsibilities get added, some things get modified depending on just a variety of different factors. So just having that sort of system in place, as opposed to a situation where you've signed a contract, you have all these clause requirements, and like I said, they're all there incorporated by reference. You've never read them. You don't know what they say until something happens, and then it becomes very relevant very quickly. So just getting on the front end of that is sort of what I was referring to.
Have you seen where people are using technology to help them manage some of this stuff? Or are you guys using technology to manage this stuff? AI
Not
or anything
like
like that?
AI, yeah. I haven't yet. I mean, that's still AI and government contracting, is a whole nother can of worms that
Right,
is
right.
developing. But I wouldn't recommend that. I think that's kind of a little untested at this point. Yes, you'll be able to find codes of conduct and things out there
Mhm.
that other companies have done, and you can use those sort of as a guidepost to how you want to do it for your company. I think AI is just so you'd have to be doing it. You'd have to have eyes on it and make sure that you're looking at all the clauses and everything, because I don't think we can trust it yet to do what we would need to do.
I guess I was thinking more of to just take a list of all those contract clauses, like you said, and catch everything so I can have a list,
Mm,
right? Not to really interpret it for me, but just like to list it out.
gotcha.
So I can be like, I can have a check, like a matrix of, okay, check, 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 like
Got
check,
it. Yeah.
right? So then I could say, hey, make sure you guys follow, like, we have to make sure all this stuff we are responsible for. Like,
Yeah. I mean, we do that, at the legal level. We go through and we identify all those clauses and we kind of say, here's the, obligations that are literally in a matrix format. I think we're
there
thinking
you
of it
go.
the same
Okay,
way.
okay,
Yeah.
all right. Yeah.
Here's the list of clauses that are in your contract. Here's what those clauses say. Here's whether there's a flow down requirement. Here's the policy and procedure you need to have in place. Here's what happens if you don't comply, basically, just to kind of spell that out for folks. And I think that's helpful for people to have to be able to refer back to as you're, and of course the clauses themselves are often very lengthy. So it's not going to be a verbatim recitation of everything that the clause says, but it's going to say, hey, this says you can't, you can't give kickbacks. You can't do this, you can't do that. So just kind of flagging that topic for folks and then being able to kind of build that out into the policies and procedures and compliance structure that I'm talking about.
Are there any recent clauses that have come out in the last, say, 6 months to a year that we should be thinking about?
Uh, yeah, there's a few. I mean, the ban on TikTok clause, I can't remember. That might be a little bit more than a year old at this point.
Is that in there?
Yeah, that's in pretty much every contract now. I can't remember the exact wording of the clause right now off the top of my head, but yeah, a ban on use of TikTok on on government contracts, right? On if you're using a device that has TikTok on it and you're also using that device to perform your government contract, like that's a problem.
Mm.
Um, there is the Federal Supply Chain Act security order clause that was recently in there about kind of on a similar. So what I guess maybe more than getting specific, more generally, what we're seeing is there's a lot of concern about our supply chains and what's getting into our supply chains and who's having access to our supply chains, who's got. So TikTok, for example, there's concerns about the government of China getting access to information through TikTok. So that's why that restriction is there. Um, and then just similarly, other types of things that are in our supply chain, like we want to make sure that we're taking those out. And I think that's rapidly evolving because technology is rapidly evolving. We had the Chinese telecommunications equipment specifically that came out. Can't remember exactly, but a few years ago at this point.
I remember that.
Yeah, that was a pretty big deal when it came out. But it was the same type of thing, like no devices from Huawei or things like that have connections to unfriendly governments. So as that's developing, we're seeing more and more of those types of restrictions in contracts. And like I said, they're coming into contracts at all levels. They're at a very low dollar threshold. Their inclusion is triggered. They're in commercial products and services contracts. It's those are the types of things that we're seeing recently, that are developing pretty quickly.
All right, let's change the subject. Let's talk about more fun stuff. Tell us about you. Where are you from? Tell us about your background.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, I'm from Michigan. I grew up outside of Detroit. Not that that's really relevant to government contracting, but
It's totally relevant. People like to identify with people.
yeah. So that's I'm from the Midwest. Like I said, I've been doing government contracts my whole career. When I graduated law school, I went to work for the Army Corps of Engineers for a few years, and then went over to DCMA, and now I'm with McCarter. But it's been, that most of the work I did with the Corps, obviously related to the kind of mission that the Corps had, which is a lot of civil works construction, a lot of milcon, and a host of other things that the Corps does, of course, but just focused on the government contracting piece. Those were really the two areas that I focused most heavily on. And then when you get to the DCMA side of things, that, like I said, is more cost reimbursement type stuff. So different sections of the FAR, but interesting to kind of get a sense of both types of contracts. I moved around a lot at DC or at Corps of Engineers. I was in their Tulsa district office, so Oklahoma for a few years, and then moved up to Boston with DCMA. I'm currently based in DC, so like I said, from Michigan, so I bounced around a few different parts of the country, and it's a great area to be in, because I think we've got clients all over the world, all over the country, all over the world, that are in this space. So I get to travel a lot and visit them and see kind of what's important to them, and like you said, there are regional differences too in terms of how companies are approaching these problems. So it's very interesting for me.
Have you been outside the country to visit a client?
I have, yes, not Canada, but
That's okay. That's not the country.
yeah, Canada, and we've got clients. I think we've been to Hawaii, right?
All right.
Yeah, it's not outside the country, but it's a long plane flight.
That's a long flight. Trust me.
Yeah, we have clients in Europe as well,
Right.
so that doesn't come up as often. But when you're able to coordinate that sort of thing, it's a great opportunity. So yeah, I mean, we have different clients that have different needs based on where they are, but it's been probably traveled maybe like once a month
Really?
ish. Yeah.
Well, and given that we have Zoom and all these things now, is the travel for like trials? Is it for
I think some of those trainings and stuff I was talking about, I think those are more effective in person. Personally, you can do them over Zoom. We have done them over Zoom. It's post pandemic, I think a lot of people like that approach, but I always prefer doing them in person, because then you can really get engagement with people when they have questions. I did one a few weeks ago, where we got really good engagement, and I don't find that works the same way over Zoom. Sometimes people will pop up with a question, but when you're actually looking at people face to face, grabbing coffee with them during the break, you really get those conversations going. So I think there's value in that. Same thing we do a lot of education and trainings and things like that across the country, and same thing, you can do those virtual, but I really like doing them in person, because you can have that interaction, and you can pivot too to, like, okay, I've been talking about, I don't know, I've been talking about Buy American for the last 45 minutes. You're interested in small business issues, so you can tell me that and we can pivot. Whereas if I'm just talking to myself on a screen, you don't have that same opportunity. So but yeah, there's a split between people that prefer to do things remote still and people that are coming back in person.
No, I mean, I'd love to do things in person. Just
Mhm.
it's not always easy or convenient.
yeah, like I said, there's people that are really. I love to travel. I love to learn about different places and go to different cities and learn about different companies and have different food and all that kind of stuff. So I'm always up for it. But yeah, it's it's a longer, it's a bigger time commitment than just logging on to Zoom for an hour and logging back off. So
Makes sense. You have you always wanted to be an attorney?
yeah, I didn't really grow up thinking I would be an attorney, but as I started to kind of continue my education, it just became a natural fit for me. Um, yeah, I liked the way that it made you think, and I've kind of found that to be the case. And as I've developed as an attorney, I actually ended up getting my MBA, and about I guess it's been about 5 years ago now. It took me a while because I was practicing at the time, but kind of a hobby, I suppose. Um, but I think that's been a great experience too, because that really gave me a lot of, I think it made me a better lawyer because I think it gave me insight into how businesses are run and how legal advice fits into their mission and what they're trying to accomplish, as opposed to just a straight legal analysis that may not have that last paragraph that says, and here's how it impacts your business. So I think that sort of combination has been beneficial for me as a lawyer.
What did it's not too private. What did your parents do for work?
Uh, they weren't they weren't attorneys. I'm the first attorney in my family. No, I mean they were, we just did a variety of different things. Like my dad was worked for a supply company, not involved with government type things, and then my mom had, various jobs over the years doing kind of a variety of different things when we were growing up. So, but yeah, I'm the first attorney.
Okay, all right. No, I just as like I said, I see what kind of how it's flowing down from the family.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of, I think it's split pretty evenly in the circles that I run in between people who have been, a whole lineage of attorneys versus,
Right, right.
I don't know where I came from. I just wanted to practice
You're
law.
not
That's what I've done.
like,
Right, exactly, exactly. And then folks that are attorneys is same thing. It's like, I don't want my kids to be lawyers,
well, that was
or
gonna be my
I
next
really
question.
want my kids to be lawyers.
That's
Yeah.
what I was gonna ask you that question. Well, how do you feel about that?
I think whatever my kids want to do, I'll support it.
Okay.
But I have some thoughts about it. I have some perspectives on if you want to go down that road, kind of you got to be willing to really dig in and do the work because it's not something you can do lightly.
No, I understand. Well, I think, one of the things that's interesting, I know they're, banning TikTok. I actually kind of like TikTok, but that's just my own personal thing. But I was listening to a book or a person on TikTok talk about a book that describes that there's so many different career paths, right? But they kind of recommend us to all become engineers and lawyers and teachers and right. There's like 20 paths they all recommend us to. But I'm sure now that you're in the space of working with small businesses, you probably see all types of different jobs of varying degrees and qualifications that you have a greater perspective that you can probably impart on your kids.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, there's those one word career. It's like, what do you do? I'm a lawyer. I'm a doctor. I'm
Right,
an engineer. I'm an
right,
accountant. I'm
right,
whatever. But yeah, there's we work all the time with companies that have really innovative strategies and are doing really innovative things that don't fit into those neat little one word categories. And that's really interesting. And I love to learn about that. And I think even now there's just careers that are evolving that didn't exist 20 years ago.
right.
So I think, and that's going to continue to be the case by the time, my generation's kids graduate from college. I'm sure they'll be doing stuff we've never heard of.
Yeah, that's good.
And
No,
yeah.
I have a nephew that he's playing with CapCut that does video editing, and he's 8 years
Mm,
old.
wow.
It's content, and I mean, I don't know how to, I don't know how to edit videos, and he's editing content and videos that he's taking on his iPhone using a software tool like that.
Wow. Yeah. I'm old enough that I remember playing like Snake on the computer.
Yeah.
Like that was the
Yeah, right.
floppy disks.
Floppy disk. I remember
Like,
floppy disk.
yeah, it's that's one of those shoulder generations that like we know how to type and we know how to on a computer and we know that, but we don't. I didn't grow up doing any of that, so
No, no,
they're ahead of me.
no, I agree. No, they're ahead of me as well. Trust me, I promise you.
Mhm.
Uh, what is a recent purchase that you made on Amazon?
uh, I'm laughing because it's silly.
I know. That's why I like those
It's well,
questions.
Halloween is coming up, and my daughter wants to be a princess, so I bought her some princess accessories.
Hey, that's great. I
Yeah.
think that's wonderful. That question usually tells a lot about people's personality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we went through, we scrolled through it, and she's got very specific ideas about what she wants. And she's like, I want this one, not that one. I'm like, okay.
Okay.
So those will all show up at my house the next day or two, and we'll try them on over the weekend and see which we like. So,
If you weren't a practicing attorney, what do you think you'd be doing?
uh, I think the same things that drew me to being an attorney, I think I'd probably use those skills in another way. So I've always enjoyed writing and that kind of thing. So I might be, I don't know if a novelist, that might be too ambitious, but something to do with putting pen to paper, finger to keyboard, if you will. Whether that would be kind of a column type of deal or I don't know, blogging is really a thing people do anymore. Maybe it is. I don't know, but that's probably where I would end up.
Is there any type of odd job that you've worked at? Well, yeah,
I had,
I like that.
I started my working life, if you will, um, in food service, like most people do, like a lot of people do, flipping burgers and worked at a concession stand and kind of did that for a few summers. And I think that's important for people to do if
No,
they can. Um, but yeah, customer service skills that you can learn early in your life, let alone your career.
right.
Yeah. They translate to even what we do today. It's just like you just need to understand that you're dealing with people.
Yeah. Well, it teaches you you're not the center of the universe.
Right.
If you were
Right.
there,
From both sides of that relationship,
right.
right? It teaches you how to work with people who, you're serving and teaches you how to treat the people that are serving you. So,
Right. Yeah.
mhm.
So no, they'll really quickly help you reflect on, hey,
Mhm.
right, the world
Right.
does not revolve around you at this moment in time. So it'll be humbled. I like that.
Hmm.
I worked at Burger King.
There you go. Yeah. Same type of thing.
Yeah, the Burger King. I enjoyed it. I enjoy all my experiences. I find a way to make that they're like you said they've contributed somewhat in my life to where I'm at today and help me.
Yeah. They don't exist in a vacuum. It all kind of builds up to where you end up.
Yeah. No, I agree. Tell people where they can find you at.
So I'm reachable on LinkedIn. My Carter in English's website, WULF. You can find me there. My email address, my phone number is all available online. I love talking to people who have the problems they need us to help solve, right? So if there's like I've talked a lot about putting together subcontracts and compliance structures and even just one-off questions about, hey, bid protests, I've talked about that. We handle all those types of things. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, I'm in crisis right now. I need someone to help. It's always, yeah, you don't know how to put this exactly. Like people need lawyers, but you never want to try to find a lawyer when you need a lawyer. It's good to have the relationship kind of already underway so that, hey, I do have a bid protest that's due in 5 days. Can you jump in on this? That you already have that relationship established. So I'm always happy to talk to folks, even if there's no immediate need, just to make sure that we can step in when there is, and then we can go from there. But yeah, on the McCarter in English website, you'll be able to find me and all my contact information.
Nice, nice, nice. And if you could say something to small businesses that you can leave them with, go ahead and let's close them out.
Yeah, I think small businesses are really powerful, right? They have a lot of ability to, the government obviously has a lot of focus on them. We've talked about. I think just know your worth and know that you have the ability to kind of take control of some of these relationships, and like I said, draft your subcontract, have that, have that ability to negotiate at that level, and you'll find success.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.